It's my great pleasure now to introduce Griselda Pollock, who's a feminist, post-colonial, queer, international art historian and cultural analyst. She is professor of social and critical histories of art and director of the Center for Cultural Analysis Theory and History at the University of Leeds. Her most recent publications include the reissue of the co-authored feminist classic Old Mistresses, the editing of the collection of the theoretical writings of artist Bracha L. Ettinger, who we've heard presenting earlier, and the monograph on the artist Charlotte Salomon. As part of the current research, she's addressing aesthetic transformation and trauma in connection to our exposure to screens. It's a pleasure to give the floor to you, Griselda, now.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to share my screen. Is that fine? Everybody sees me? Is that
yes,
working?
I believe it's working.
Okay, and I just go to that. There we are. Hello, everybody, and I think you're all amazing if anybody is there at all after this marathon. Thank you very much, Carolyn and Stella and everybody in your team for organizing this event. As you can see, I'm sitting outside in a wonderful sunrise in Northern Europe in the winter. I always have an outside background to escape some aspects of our enclosure. Now, when asked to share the sense of the digital age as generating possible trauma, subjecting us all to post-traumatic stress, I was at first entirely unable to respond. I love staying at home. I love not having to travel. As a workaholic with a love of being with others, I have enjoyed staying at my desk and traveling to Bogota in Colombia, or to Rhode Island, or to Melbourne in Australia, without having jet lag, without having to waste 2 days getting there and 2 days coming back, and having all sorts of experiences of wondering why I have gone all these distances to talk to somebody for 1 hour. I love preparing texts and PowerPoints and recording talks, yet I know the evils that are part of this digital connectivity that are violently capturing the imaginations of younger people whose sort of aborted access to the world keeps them in their bedrooms, confines them to their screens, and have halted their lives by making them stay at home when they should have been away from home. They should be with their peers, but they're with their parents. They should be dancing when in fact they're lying in their beds. They should be doing sport. They should be being in the world which was meant to be part of the critical process of their coming of age. And what is their compensation but a diet of social media, video gaming, pornography, and all the internet smartphones places in their bedrooms? Now, I personally have doubted the values and purposes of the social media from their inception. I have no space on social media. I think it has produced nothing new, but has given every one of the social evils of incivility a global reach. I do not turn to art to interpret or transform at the level, because we are complicit and captured by these communicative possibilities that have also become the very highways for all that was always there, but was muffled, or as it were silenced, by the lack of electronic systems of distribution. I believe somehow we are all responsible for our own ambivalence with regard to what we use our technologies for. So that's kind of my opening statement. And now, well, I really wanted to go to the National Gallery in London because they finally bought a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. And to honor it, they've created an exhibition, typically called Artemisia, familiarizing the feminine. And I would love to wander through these hallowed halls to arrive slowly at a chance to encounter the works of Artemisia Gentileschi collected all together. Now, my research began in 1974 as a feminist in the basement of that very museum, which was completely, more or less, empty of artists. There were 7 works and they were all in the basement. So I wrote a very angry book, a rather brilliant book, actually, as turned out, to express my rage at the absence, what was missing from the museum. And the book was Old Mistresses, Women, Art and Ideology, written by two feminists, young graduates. We had no idea what we were doing, but we felt the weight of patriarchy upon us. And with the help of a certain amount of chocolate, we tried to work out why men could laugh at us for even thinking that women were worth studying. Now, the book has had a very long life and it's just been published in its 4th edition. I'm sorry about the publicity, but on the cover, I had to make a choice what to put there. And so I put the hand of Artemisia Gentileschi because I love this drawing by Pierre de Moustier II, which is just the hand, the whole issue of that whole world of hand making art, the touch of the painter, the physical holding of the paintbrush, which reminds us of this amazing and wonderful allegory of painting that Artemisia Gentileschi, in which she took hold of the iconography of the representation of painting, la pittura, as a woman with a wonderful clothing, with her hair in disarray. It should have a binding across the mouth to remind us that painting is mute. But Gentileschi created from that a statement that there is no need for iconological fantasy. There is simply the question of the work, the making. Now, if I could go to this exhibition, I would have been very happy. But it seems to be one of those terrible events in my life that because of the pandemic, it's very unlikely that I will make it the 200 miles, 150 or 350 kilometers to London to be able to go to the National Gallery. I have waited 50 years to see a single museum collect together a major collection of the work of an artist like Gentileschi, whom I have studied for all these years. But this is not a trauma, it's simply an ironic tragedy. And I don't want to overestimate the issues of trauma. Why do I want to go there? Because I need to see these material things. I need to see how large they are. I need to see that the painting on the left is probably the cut down version of the painting on the right. We don't know why. I need to be with the works that her hand touched, that her hand thus made, that her body painted, that her mind imagined, while her time of what Bracha Ettinger will call a certain kind of fascinance in the making encoded it with its own sheets of time, that I need time with the objects to unfold into the images that I will come to know and that will then haunt me, even with a mask for fear. Now, in 2013, I published another book, which was on the Virtual Feminist Museum, not cybernetic, because it's proposing the virtuality of feminism, that feminism is still to come, that we don't know yet what it is. It's an unharvested potential for transformation. But the book was also about the question as whether art could be a site of the transformation of traumatic experiences. And I studied Louise Bourgeois, Anna Maria Maiolino, Alina Shapochnikoff, Vera Frenkel, Sarah Kaufman, Chantal Ackerman, and all through the lenses of the work of the matrixial theory of Bracha Ettinger. Now, I also curated an exhibition of Bracha Ettinger in which I wrote about the exhibition she made. Even though I thought I'd curated it, she made it. I then wrote the book about it, which is an exploration of specifically the questions of trauma and transformation in her work. Now, my question as I wrote the book was what actually defines trauma, what generates the symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And I identified trauma under the following categories. First of all, one has to understand overwhelming experience, literally, as it were, literally overwhelms the psyche, overwhelms the defenses which we put forward to try and negotiate our mediate our relationship to the world. And therefore it becomes lodged within us as a perpetual present. It knows no time, it's always there. It's also, by the same motion, a perpetual absence because we have no means of grasping it or representing it or holding on to it. It has simply, as it were, overwhelmed our defenses and lodged itself within. It is in fact a kind of a void rather than a substance. And this means that it's unrepresentable. We don't know what it is. in Bracha's terms, we don't know what it is that haunts us. It does haunt us, but we don't know what that it is. It's not therefore easily translatable into any of the terms that we have. But, and the fourth math characteristic is that it does, however, as it were, deposit its uncharged, undischarged excess of anxiety in occasions that are precipitated by later events. So there's always a kind of belatedness to the question of trauma, that it is not it that somehow post-traumatically registers, it's some relationship between something in the present and the past, which becomes connected without forming into a fundamental element. And the other one is it's transmissible. It's transmissible through the generations, and in some sense we're exploring the ways in which it becomes transmissible through art, not as a representation and not as necessary as a symptom, but in a certain sense as a trace. So the questions I had to confront was, when I studied my work, was, do artists who are dealing with traumatic burdens and the weight travel away from, or actually do they spend their lives traveling towards the encounter with the traces of trauma? Can these traces be encountered and transformed only when, by virtue of the artist's long practice, and a certain aesthetic economy has been created to encounter, to hold, and to transform these unsurcharged, unformulated, voidly, sort of permanently absent yet permanently pressurizing dimensions that affects we call trauma? Can the after affects, not the thing itself, of trauma find formulations? And I borrowed this from Abi Warburg, the idea of a formulation of intensity, not a representation in a kind of semiotic sense, but something that can convey the intensity of the affective charge. Can they produce after images? Is trauma sometimes, however, encrypted, not simply just this haunting force, but somehow, in fact, is this in Abraham and Turok's concept of a crypt, a kind of entombed, unprocessed element that's lodged within? Can it resurface and reclaim the subject and literally take over the subject rather than being transported into some kind of notion that it can be transformed? And finally, can the re-encounter with trauma be deadly? I found in several cases that return to or attempting to touch these places led to devastating effects, including morbid anxiety and depression that led to suicide. So this is not a kind of notion of cure. This is extremely dangerous in many cases. And finally, are we witnessing, in the aftermath of both historical trauma and often personal trauma in terms of individuals, bereavement, assault, losses of various sorts, as opposed to the grand historical ones, are we witnessing, in fact, what's happening in art as the formulation of new formulae, pathos formulae, new formulations of affectively charged images because of the specificity of post-conceptual artistic practice, or formulations that include the use of the very media whose virtualizing effects we are critiquing today? So can art transform experiences virtually in relation to not just the virtuality of the media, but virtuality in terms and sense of a displacement? And can they do that with pathos formulations of intensity for our time? And then we have to ask is, what time are we in? So I turned to the sociologist Anthony Bryant, who's a social theorist of the Information Society, who is asking, are we in the age of digitalization? And has written an article that's about to be published called The Hitchhiker's Guide to Research Practice in the Age of Digitalization, which draws on obviously the reference to Douglas Adams, to the fiction of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he is obviously a theorist of the communication and the information society. And on the cover of his book is this wonderful cartoon, because I think we need some lightweight. Now, forget it, talking to Alexander Graham Bell, no one's ever going to want a mobile telephone that takes photos and play music. Who could have foreseen that this was, in a sense, the logic of the initial creation of the telephone? Now, Anthony Bryant brings together three guides. One is Norbert Elias, who created the idea of the civilizing process, the processo di civilazione, which is the idea that somehow between the 15th century and the 20th century, the Europeans created a particular vision of the world, which was to sustain European suprematism, that they alone, the Europeans, were civilized and thus recreated the rest of the world in the image of kind of barbaric peoples condemned to a timeless, savage eternity. And of course, this is precisely what we're disrupting now with the whole question of decolonization, anti-racism, feminism, and other kinds of disturbances to the kind of institutions, cultures, practices, even body modes of this moment of European suprematism. Also, it draws upon Antonio Gramsci's idea that sometimes between different kind of eras, there's an interregnum. An interregnum is what happens between two monarchs, but it can be a period in which dangerous things occur. And in the interregnum between one world order and a new world order, we are subject to incredible menace, some of which is happening to us through the digital. And thirdly, he brings on Zygmunt Bauman, the great Polish sociologist, whose concept of the condition that we're in now is called liquid modernity. And this is modernity which is no longer going anywhere. It no longer has its deadly telos that arrived at Hiroshima and Auschwitz. It is modernity changing itself for the sake of the changing itself. It is an iteration without destination. And in this sense, we have, on the one hand, Elias's notion that somehow the pattern of development within all sorts of societies in the 15th century across the world, which came together to create a large-scale transformation of the human society in terms of European suprematism and its others. But now we are faced with a kind of process of potential de-civilizing, which is both positive in the sense of dethroning that European suprematism, colonialism, racism, gender and sexual centrism, which we are part of. These multiple critiques we face, but it actually has become, by virtue of one of the spin-offs of the Industrial Revolution into the technological and now the digital revolution, is an uncivil, an anti-civil in the old-fashioned sense, a de-civilizing, i.e. taking us out from being members of a civil society as a result of the means, practices, subjectivities, and actions that are made possible by technologies which were created for other reasons and often by accident. So for instance, Twitter, which I consider to be one of the most lethal, was simply a mechanism for engineers to talk to each other without having to phone each other as they were doing various things, but it's now become the basis of public speech acts which come from anywhere and then have a public space which, by virtue of retweeting and going viral, become part of the imagination of our publics. So in this threesome, we move on to the concept of possibly has what has happened to us produced what the founder or the creator of the World Wide Web, who gave us the platform for all of this distribution, Tim Berners-Lee, has said to himself that what has happened is almost a digital dystopia. And he says we are going to have to do something around the web immediately. I think people's fear of bad things happening is becoming greater and greater. The web is there as a very large number of things are wrong. We could end up with a digital dystopia. Even though I created it, I shared it to the world in the image of creating, in a sense, a communicative civility of a new world that was a kind of utopia. But when you ask who is that we who will turn the world on? What we white man in the old world from the famous joke about the Lone Ranger and I just lost his name, Conto, who says, well, we must fight, but what we is this? What is this collective that might change this, as he asks for a social contract? And the third party of this party is, of course, Zygmunt Bauman, whose concept of liquid modernity refers to a phase of modernity that is marked by modernity acting on itself in an iterative, ceaseless kind of manner, devoid of any specific objective. There is no destination and no form of stability, only perpetual transience. And given Bauman's depiction of liquid modernity, we can characterize the present period, starting from the 1990s, as a paradoxical period of between orders that we can grasp hold of, one without any terminating point or destination, which has become a truly Kafkaesque scenario. Where are you going? Away from here, only away from here, writes Kafka at a certain point. There is a kind of a horrifying and very traumatizing sense of losing the possibility that we can have any sense of the direction. It simply is a ceaseless kind of train and transformation, which is being driven increasingly by technology, but in that terms, going back to Elias, creating humans in their image. And that's the thing that should concern us. So have we, in this sense, forgotten to learn from artists who have been critically at work for decades with and on the possibilities of the sort of these technologies, which are more dialectically engaged with both social commentary on the way they register tendencies in the world, but also offer for possibilities? Because of course, it's not the technology and not the society alone, that it is in some sense we who are caught up in some fantasy of the Promethean power of the digit, but not the digit of the hand, but the digit of the mathematics, which becomes the basis of digitalization, while at the same time imagining, or not imagining, but allowing ourselves to be recreated in this new image, which does not seem to have a godlike source. It seems to be, in a sense, integrated with who and what we are. But I always think it's important to look at the other hand of God, which is touching, embracing, loving, one of the great queer images in the Catholic Christian art world. But this form of God's hand is disturbing, for to say the least, in that particular instance. So as I come to the conclusion, I turn to artists, and one of the artists whom I discussed in my book about trauma, who was one of the very first artists to engage with video. Vera Frenkel is not as internationally known in the world as she should be. She has shown all over the world, from Japan through Toronto, Scandinavia through to Britain, Paris. But in 1974, the first work that she explored with the notion, with using the very new technology of video conferencing, was to have two groups of people undertake, under her direction, a very complicated networking action with their real fingers by using the game called Cat's Cradle, where you have to do certain gestures with strings. They were being directed, one in Toronto and one in Montreal, controlled by her central talent. And this has just been exhibited in this year. It was sort of, as younger artists have gone back and begun to discover this archaeology of artists critically working with the question of what these new technologies could mean and what they could do. So she explored real-time video transmission at the Bell Canada teleconferencing studios in Toronto. Giving her experiment an improvisational structure, she shows the Cat's Cradle finger string game, so I'm coming back to a different kind of digit, as the mode of orchestrated movement in the service of a constantly transforming whole. Now we need, I think, therefore, the archaeology of some of these works to explore this. And if we remember that teleconferencing actually was first thought of in 1870 and was already developed by the late 20th century, 19th century, and has arrived only with what we are now doing by Zoom 2011. This is a particularly long historically. Now, during Frieze this year in London, Vera Frenkel was selected by Zoe Whiteley, who is curating a particular element of frieze on possessions of viewing room, and therefore it was possible, in a sense, to introduce into the virtual frieze a work that was already itself had a technological base. These are the artists she included. But during the residency in the 1990s, Vera Frenkel became very fascinated by the emergence of the shopping mall in Britain. Now, obviously, interestingly, the very shopping mall that she studied, which was in Gateshead, in just near Newcastle in the north of Britain, closed as a result of the COVID pandemic. It actually has been destroyed, but what she found within it was not only all the shops, but all the forms of entertainment, including a World War I warplane. You could ride a carousel, you could play with clowns, and there was a redemption store. And this led to a three-stage work, which she calls the Messiah. This is your Messiah speaking. So in 1990, the Piccadilly, which is one of the great centers of the shopping universe, the universe of the very economy that has been so badly affected, i.e. in the sense that our economy is entirely based, it seems, on the manufactures of goods for consumption. And when they say the economies of our worlds have been decimated under the pandemic, we know that all the things that need to be produced are being produced, but in a sense, the anxiety is that we have not been shopping. And it's as the shopping, that endless shopping, and then having hospitality, all these other activities. It's not because we're not going to museums that our economies are collapsing. It's because we are not consuming to the same end. But high above Piccadilly Circus, she put this piece called The Messiah. This is your Messiah speaking in around the question of shopping. And the issue here is the kind of the investment of objects and practices, as it were, with fantasies of desire, fantasies ultimately of some kind of redemption. And this idea that we are somehow in a kind of dystopic world of digitality, which is, you know, building up in all the terms that people have described over the course of this day, is part, in a sense, of our kind of the negative side of our actual desire for something which will, as it were, relieve us, give us bliss, give us a solution, some kind of sense of where we will find salvation. And I want to end in a way with the third and final part of this, the Messiah with the right credentials, which is a multi-channel public work that Vera Frenkel designed for Toronto's transit system, i.e. the subway system, the underground system, to mark the 100th anniversary conference of Marshall McLuhan, the man who told us that the medium is the message. So I'm going to just play some of this for you as a conclusion. And this is with permission of Vera Frenkel herself.
Don't want to do. There's no rush, he said. There's no rush, he said. There's no rush, he said. No one will ever force you to do anything you don't want to do. There's no rush, he said. Don't worry. No one will force you to do anything you don't want to do. No one will ever force you to do anything you don't want to do. There's no rush, he said. But do shop around, he said. This is your Messiah speaking, instructing you to shop. And that afternoon at the shopping center, he said, devil that he was, he said that very afternoon at the shopping center, this is your Savior speaking. The best in the business. Welcome, he said. Shop around. Look sharp. Be smart. And I'll tell you a story, a true story, he said. About a people, he said, who didn't shop around. Listen carefully. And he, their leader, he said, Devil that he was, he said, take off your clothes. They listened carefully. And they took off all their clothes, he said. Then, naked in the tireless palm of fate, still listening carefully, they burned all their belongings and waited on the shore for redemption. For 1,000 years of peace, for the millennium. They waited, and as they waited, it grew cold, it grew dark. In the cold, dark wilderness, they waited for peace and plenty, for the millennium. And as they waited, made shrines out of weapons of war. You see, from this, of course, he continued, we listened carefully. You see, from this, he continued, how crucial it is to choose the Messiah with the right credentials.
And I just want to finish with the fact that I said I have been fine. My age, my profession, my pension, my employment, my house has created an environment in which it is sustainable to live through this pandemic, even though I am appalled at the prospect of trying to accommodate myself to returning to the world. What I do feel is a terrible grief for the young art students that I've been teaching this year, who did not have the celebration when they completed their degrees. They could not bring their families and friends to justify the dedication that led them to create the art that they have, who have been doing their tutorials with me online in their teenage bedrooms, back in their homes in lockdown. I've been passionately concerned about the school children with their interrupted education, and for all the young people whose key moments of change that will never come again, because they are the rituals of youth and becoming an adult. It is precisely through art that they may come to track and measure the meaning of so violent a change of expectations, because this is being recognized and their analysis of experience is being solicited so that form and effect can be explored for this a moment in their lives. I know there are lots of articles on the internet now about the fatigue of being on Zoom and the widespread depression and loneliness, which is very real for those who do not have the means of being reached out to people who are not being phoned regularly, who are not able to be in contact, even by these residual forms. And these are real. But these technologies have also become means of ameliorating the enforced isolation, where we can still hear voices even if we cannot touch bodies. And we can maintain the regularity of human contact, which is what I've done with many people that I should have always done, but only under the circumstances have completed. So I find myself ambivalent in relation to this conference, but hoping that ultimately my deep and profound faith in the capacity of artists to help and guide us. I did some research about the art and the Spanish flu, hoping to find that that particular pandemic generated various things. It clearly generated T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It's also traced in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. And I'm sure, in fact, I'll come to realize that when I say that the 20th century was a catastrophic 20th century, most of whose art is a post-traumatic response, symptomatic response to things that were so overwhelming in that century, that in fact the pandemic was one of them, and it's the great forgotten one. It appears in Charlotte Salomon's, the work of Charlotte Salomon, the artist that I have just recently discussed, insofar as her mother committed suicide, but it was easy to explain that death by simply saying that she had succumbed to flu. So I'm beginning to see the traces of this registered across the art of the 20th century and thinking this through. And therefore we may put our present situation into a larger historical context of the conditions in which this dialectic between the attempt to give pathos formula by which we become to recognize the intensity of what we've gone through is linked with, in fact, a much more kind of complex negotiation of the possibilities of artistic practice that itself is the product of the transformations of technology, hence what we call the post-conceptual. For the vast majority of the works we go to nowadays include duration as a result of various forms of cinematic, filmic, and digital technologies, as well as giving us still the encounter with things that were made by hand. And I wanted to hopefully bring those two things together with the digit and the digitalization. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Griselda, for this great presentation that opened up the context also for some of the following talks of the closing hours of this day-long event. Just to summarize Griselda's presentation for those that might have connected just now, Griselda Pollock's presentation was titled Aesthetic Transformation and Trauma on Screen Now, addressing the age of digitization before reflecting on the characteristics of trauma. Something that happens, but we do not know it. It haunts that we cannot grasp the shape of what haunts. Drawing on this interpretation, Pollock asked whether our current social experience of physical distance and fearful dissociation and exposure to screen association may be defined as traumatic. Is it not the social conditions and the content rather than the technology that is stressing us? So I'll leave you with this question and suggest to wait until the next presentation that Julia will introduce. Thank you very much once again, Griselda.
You're most welcome.